Following the federal disaster at Chancellorsville, the Army of the Potomac ceded the initiative to General Robert E. Lee, just as it had a year before after Second Manassas. The ever-aggressive Lee realized this gave him another opportunity to put the Union Army on the defensive by launching a campaign into the North. But miscues and poor decisions would doom Lee's second invasion and lead to the first real turning point of the war. A move north would allow the farmers of Virginia a chance to work their farms without interference. It would also provide the Army a chance to live off of northern bounty for a season. Lastly, it might give impetus to the peace movement and create favorable conditions for a negotiated peace to end the war. Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy, agreed with Lee's analysis and approved the invasion. The Army would move without Stonewall Jackson, its most brilliant tactician. Of all the casualties of Chancellorsville, the loss of Jackson was the most significant. It threw the command structure of the Army of Northern Virginia into flux, and would have far-reaching ramifications the next time the armies met. Lee prepared for the coming invasion without the man he referred to as his right arm. Before Lee could actually get his army on the road, the Confederate cause suffered another setback, thanks to a surprise attack on Jeb Stuart's cavalry encampment at Brandy Station on the morning of June 9th, 1863. In one of the few saber-swinging mounted actions of the war, the rebels eventually rallied and fought their attackers to a standstill. Although it was a draw, the battle had two important repercussions.
To Jeb Stuart, war is a lark. It is a hoot. It is Robin Hood with boots and saddles. And he loves it. He thrives in it. One of these people that truly thrives on it. But in all the previous battles, when he just rode up with his men, he just had to come in, wave his cavalier hat, rally his Virginia horsemen, and roll over the Union cavalry. But Brandy Station, Stuart is surprised, and he doesn't drive them off. The Union retreats, but they retreat in good order. They make a point. They come over and fight him toe-to-toe, Union cavalry against Confederate cavalry, and they give as good as they got.
The second impact of the skirmish at Brandy Station was on Jeb Stuart's ego. He had always enjoyed favorable coverage in the Southern newspapers, but his abilities were openly questioned after the surprising draw. This was a new and unpalatable situation for him.
There's a lot of speculation as to what were the motivations Jeb Stuart had to make his famous ride up north when Lee invaded Pennsylvania and got separated from Lee's main army and therefore was not able to help Lee. What his motivations were to go off and seek glory. Was this something that Lee had actually ordered? He was following orders to the best of his ability? Or did he also feel the sting from Brandy Station and the negative press he got? He'd always enjoyed very positive press up to that point. So was the negative press that he was now getting forcing him to make a bad decision to ride off on this long raid where he was trying to win back some of the glory they had attained earlier and therefore made a hideous mistake that resulted in crippling Lee's ability to get information and reconnaissance for the Gettysburg campaign?
Whatever his motivation, Stuart took advantage of his orders and with his 3 best brigades set out on another ride around the Union Army. Although the raid provoked consternation in the North, it was of little military value and seriously hampered Lee's reconnaissance efforts in support of the move north. Only Only a few weeks removed from Chancellorsville, the most dramatic Confederate operation of the war began as General Lee consolidated his Army of Northern Virginia and began the march into Pennsylvania. Lee carried with him a letter from Jefferson Davis addressed to President Lincoln offering terms of surrender. Lee was supposed to present it to Lincoln upon the capture of Washington, D.C. For 2 years, the United States had been tortured by the war's gruesome cost. Awash in a sea of blood, Lee and his officers launched the new offensive to end the fighting and restore peace, with the Confederacy gaining its independence. He had thrown the dice in this risky gamble, but for Lee, the end prize was worth it. A blessed end to the killing if he succeeded. As Lee moved north and his subordinates drove the Yankee army out of the Shenandoah, General Jeb Stuart took his cavalry brigades out into the countryside. Ignoring his orders to remain in touch with Lee, Stuart disappeared in a wild chase into Pennsylvania and left the Army of Northern Virginia blind. To counter Lee's new movements, General Hooker put the Army of the Potomac on the road and gave chase.
Following the Battle of Chancellorsville, General Hooker has really lost the confidence of the senior leadership of the Army of the Potomac, and ultimately he'll lose the confidence of President Lincoln. So even while General Lee's army is beginning its move north, Hooker will be out and he'll be replaced by General Meade, who did an excellent job as a corps commander during Chancellorsville.
Lee's men crossed the Potomac and moved into Pennsylvania, eager to requisition supplies and clothing. Many of the men didn't even have shoes, while the rags of their uniforms hung about them in tatters.
By the spring of 1863, Lee's army was pretty malnourished and underfed. The men didn't have proper clothing, and many of them didn't even have shoes. So one of the reasons why the men themselves were looking forward to going into Pennsylvania was to forage amongst areas that had not been touched by the war up to this point. And as Heath's division moved forward into the countryside, they learned that there was a supply of Union boots and shoes at Gettysburg, and so they started heading over there to get some shoes, and that's really one of the things that precipitated the Battle of Gettysburg.
Meanwhile, as Heth's men marched on Gettysburg, 2 brigades of Union cavalry reached the crossroads village and made contact with a Southern infantry brigade. This brief contact convinced the Union commander, General John Buford, that a large portion of the Confederate army was descending on Gettysburg.
General Buford and his cavalry have detected the movement of the Confederate army, and as he looks around at the high ground around Gettysburg, he determines that this is the best defensive terrain he's seen in the area. So he determines at that point to stay and defend this ground to allow the Union Army time to come up and form a defensive position. He's very concerned about whether or not he'll be supported, however, and he sends back to General Reynolds, the 1st Corps commander, and Reynolds sends him back a message that says, "Hold the ground, we'll be there in time to help you."
What had begun as a quest for shoes would soon turn into a sharp and violent fight. Throughout the night of June 30th, Buford's cavalry troopers dug in along Hers Ridge about 2 miles from downtown Gettysburg. As morning came and the Confederate infantry began assembling on the Chambersburg Pike, Buford and his exhausted men anxiously awaited General Reynolds and his excellent corps of infantry. Until 1st Corps reached the scene, Buford's troopers knew they would have to go it alone. Dismounted cavalry can never hold off a determined infantry attack for long. But on this cool summer morning, Buford hoped to delay the Confederate soldiers long enough so that the rest of the army could take up positions around Gettysburg. He would buy time with the lives of his men while praying Reynolds would come save his command. Until 1st Corps reached him, his 1,200 troopers would have to battle Heth's 4 brigades, some 7,500 men. But the Union cavalry had one big advantage. breech-loading Sharps rifles.
If you can load from the breech, then you can load faster, and you can load from a more secure position behind the wall, behind a tree, laying on the ground, whatever. It may not be as accurate, but try telling that to a man that's standing there trying to load a Springfield standing up, that all those bullets outside around him may not be as accurate as his own. It's still kind of hard to concentrate on what you're doing when all this lead's flying around your head.
That morning, Heth's men gathered in a long column on the Chambersburg Pike and began the march to Gettysburg and its storehouse of boots.
The previous evening, Heath had actually gone forward and undertaken a personal reconnaissance of the situation, and he had seen on a hill outside, or a ridge outside of Gettysburg, some Union troops. And he figured that these guys were probably just militia, local militia defending the town. And in the morning, he'd just bring his division up and brush the opposition aside and take the shoes that the division needed in Gettysburg. And that actually was a dreadful miscalculation and proved to be one of the flashpoints for the subsequent battle.
Instead of militia, the Southern infantry drove right into John Buford's veteran cavalry and prepared positions behind a fence. The Union troopers poured lead into the surprised Confederates, who hastily deployed for battle on either side of the Chambersburg Pike. It took some time before Heth's division was properly deployed, but when it advanced again, its full power fell upon Buford's two understrength brigades. The attack blew the Union troopers off Her Ridge and sent them scurrying back to their secondary defensive position along McPherson's Ridge. Here, Buford's men made a gallant stand. But it was only a matter of time before sheer weight of numbers would overwhelm them. The Union position soon started to break. And just as Buford's troopers began to fall back, the First Corps finally reached the battle. Buford's desperate fight had not been in vain. The Iron Brigade was in the vanguard. Having earned their nickname at 2nd Manassas, they wore distinctive black hats. Reynolds rode forward with his 1st Brigade, urging them to clear a tangled grove of trees and slam into the Confederate right flank.
Reynolds rode forward up the hill, urging his men from the 1st Brigade to push ahead and turn the rebels' flank. As he did so, a Confederate sharpshooter hiding in a stone barn got a bead on him and put a bullet under his eye. Just as he was crying, "Forward, men, for God's sakes, forward," he fell from his horse, dead. It was a terrific loss for the Union Army.
His death affected us much, for he was one of the soldier generals of the army, a man whose soul was in his country's work, which he did with a soldier's high honor and fidelity. He was the very beau ideal of the gallant general. Mounted upon a superb black horse with his head thrown back and his black eyes flashing fire, he was everywhere upon the field, seeing all things and giving commands in person. He died as many a friend and many a foe to the country have died in this war. Lieutenant Frank A. Haskell, 6th Wisconsin Volunteers.
Despite Reynolds' death, the Iron Brigade surged forward and shattered the Confederate right. Many of the survivors of General James Archer's brigade were captured, including Archer himself. Archer became the only Confederate general captured at Gettysburg. At the same time Archer was being driven from McPherson's woods, the Confederates launched a counterattack against the Union right flank. As more 1st Corps units deployed on McPherson's Ridge, one-armed General Howard's 11th Corps arrived in support. Howard's men reached the battlefield just in time to avoid a major crisis. Union pickets had spotted Confederate troops pouring down the roads north of Gettysburg. With the 1st Corps totally committed along McPherson's Ridge, there had been nothing to stop the Southern force from getting behind the Union line and crushing it in a gigantic pincher attack with Heth's division. Now, with 11th Corps on the field, the Federals had a chance of stopping the unfolding attack. Sending 6,000 men in 2 divisions north of Gettysburg, Howard ordered a defensive line established at right angles to the 1st Corps' line on McPherson's Ridge. The Confederates bearing down from the north belonged to Ewell's Corps, which had been at Carlisle and York.
General Lee has ordered the concentration at Gettysburg simply by looking at the map and seeing where the roads came together. So General Ewell and his corps arrive in the right place at the right time to dramatically affect this battle simply by a stroke of luck.
As Ewell's men reached the battlefield, General Rhodes' division faced the Union center, while the men of Jubal Early's division, coming from York, arrived on the Union extreme right wing.
The Confederates attacked immediately. General Rhodes led his Confederate division forward in a fairly uncoordinated attack, and it was driven back by Union gunfire with some casualties. But just then, General Robert E. Lee arrived on the battlefield. He was not terribly pleased to see a battle going on that he hadn't ordered, and it took him a few minutes to assess the position, but when he did, he realized that he was presented with a golden opportunity. He ordered an attack all along the line.
Heavily outnumbered and outflanked on the right, the Federal forces fell back. Particularly vicious fighting occurred in the 1st Corps area, as A.P. Hill's rebels paid a stiff price for every foot they advanced. But the Confederates continued to push the 1st Corps back. To the north of town, the 11th Corps broke and routed. As the troops fell back, they exposed the 1st Corps' right flank, which forced Doubleday to withdraw.
When General Lee moves forward, he sees that the Union forces that have been pushed back are beginning to reorganize on the top of Cemetery Hill. So he orders A.P. Hill to immediately move forward and attack them before they can reorganize. Unfortunately, Hill believes his men are too tired. Ewell, for his part, doesn't push anybody forward till about 6 p.m., and by then the Union forces have become reorganized and are able to resist sufficiently.
On Cemetery Hill, the Union infantry rallied and dug in. As the line began to form from along the northern face of the hill and over to Culp's Hill, General Winfield Scott Hancock reached the battlefield with orders from Meade to take overall command of the Union force. Meade finally got to Gettysburg late that night and, after consulting with his corps commanders, resolved to stand and fight.
At the end of the day, Lee had 45,000 men on the field facing only 16,000 Union soldiers. But Lee's troops were disorganized, they were tired, they were short on ammunition, and while some attempts were made to push the issue around Culp's Hill for a little while, when the Confederates saw that the Yankee troops were dug in on top of the hill, they decided to wait for another day. This was a golden opportunity to destroy a part of the Army of the Potomac right there before sundown, and the South did not take it. They wouldn't get another chance like that again.
As the second day of Gettysburg opened, the Union Army lay stretched in a fishhook-like position from Culp's Hill along Cemetery Hill and around to the south along part of Cemetery Ridge. As more units reached the battlefield, General Meade used them to extend his left flank down almost to a rocky hill known to the locals as Little Round Top. His decision to bolster his left proved to be the most important decision he made all day, since that was exactly where General Lee planned to strike. That morning, the Union 3rd Corps arrived on the battlefield, much to Meade's relief. He ordered its commander, hot-blooded General Dan Sickles, to bolster the Union left and throw his brigades out in a line down all the way to Little Round Top.
In General Sickles' area, Cemetery Ridge is really not that prominent terrain feature. So he sees another area that looks like a better defensive position and moves his corps forward to the area of the Peach Orchard. This is one of the most controversial moves of the war because in doing that, he's exposed his corps and placed them squarely in line of the coming Confederate attack.
As Meade's lines were strengthened throughout the day by additional corps, Robert E. Lee was busy waiting for his own men to move into position and launch a new attack.
Now, right here, you had a big conflict arise between General Longstreet and his commander, Robert E. Lee. Longstreet looked at that line of hills and thought the better thing to do was to go around them, not to attack the Union Army, but to move towards Washington, D.C., find a nice defensive position, and let the Union Army come to the Confederates and attack. Lee thought that since here they were on the battlefield, things had gone well the first day, they should fight where they were and launch an attack on the Union position.
General Lee listened to Longstreet's suggestions, but ultimately rejected them all. Instead, he ordered 2 of Longstreet's divisions to march south and take up positions across from the Union left, which was assumed to run along the entire length of Cemetery Ridge. Once in position, the 2 divisions would attack en echelon up the Emmitsburg Road and slam into the Union left. Lee hoped to break Meade's left wing and then pour into the Union rear, dealing a decisive defeat to the Army of the Potomac.
Lee's plan for the assault on the Union left envisioned this en echelon attack up the Emmitsburg Pike in a northeasterly direction. But that's not really the way the attack actually was executed. Longstreet's divisions moved further south than Lee had originally envisioned, and then the need to take Little Round Top, because it was the outstanding terrain feature in the area, forced the Confederates to attack due east. And so the attack really unfolded in a way that Lee really did not contemplate originally.
What looked like an easy march south turned out to be an ordeal. Longstreet's scouts and engineers had selected a road that exposed his troops to Union eyes on Little Round Top, forcing the men to countermarch for 2 hours to reach another road that offered full concealment. At the time the 2 divisions under General Lafayette McLaws and General John B. Hood approached their jump-off positions, it was after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Hood and McLaws planned to start their assault from the area around Emmitsburg Road, but when they reached the area, they stumbled into Sickles' corps.
McLaws took a look at Sickles' position and reported back to Longstreet that there were Federal troops out along the Emmitsburg Pike. This completely disjointed the planned Confederate attack. Longstreet refused to change the orders, saying this is what Lee wanted him to do. The usually aggressive John Bell Hood of Texas took a look at the position and thought it was far better to go around the Round Tops and come at them from behind than it was to go straight up them. It was late in the day, though, and Longstreet told him these were Lee's orders to attack straight toward the Union Army, and so they did.
Just after 4 o'clock that afternoon, Longstreet's attack finally began. Hood kicked it off with an assault on Sickles' left flank, which was anchored on a strange rocky formation known as the Devil's Den. The assault went forward, but the terrain played havoc with the Southern regiments.
As the Confederate assault moves forward into the Devil's Den, most of Hood's division will become involved in a very bloody skirmish with Ward's brigade. But force of numbers and and the impetus of the attack will move the Confederates through this area of rocky boulders and things into the valley beyond, facing the Round Tops. And because of the intensity of fighting in this area and the difficulty of the terrain and the attack, this area will earn the grisly title of the Slaughter Pen.
On the far right of the Confederate assault, General Evander Law's brigade waded into the fray and split into two groups. Part of the brigade stayed to fight around Devil's Den, while the 15th and 47th Alabama Volunteers pushed on for Big Round Top. The Federals had left both Round Tops virtually unprotected. But as the Confederates approached the eastern slope of Big Round Top, General Meade's chief engineers spotted the threat to the Union left. If the Round Tops fell into Southern hands, they would have the high ground on the Union left. The whole Federal line would be compromised. Astonished to find both hills bare of troops, he quickly sought out two brigades and ordered them posted on Little Round Top.
The nearest Union brigade was commanded by a guy named General Strong Vincent. And Vincent had volunteered to take his outfit up onto Little Round Top and deploy his men there, and that's exactly what happened. He got up there and he deposted the 44th New York, the 83rd Pennsylvania, and the 20th Maine. Now, the 20th Maine formed the absolute left of the Union Army. There was nothing to the left of the 20th Maine. And the fact that this little regiment had that responsibility turned out to be an incredibly lucky choice, because the outfit was commanded by one of the great fighting leaders of the Civil War, a fellow by the name of Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain.
The 20th Maine formed the extreme left flank of the entire Union Army. If it caved to the coming rebel attack, the Federal defenses on Little Round Top could be systematically rolled up. As Chamberlain and the rest of Vincent's brigade established their defensive positions, the two Alabama regiments took Big Round Top. Turning north, they pushed down the hill slope into the swale just south of Little Round Top. Meanwhile, four more Confederate regiments under General Jerome Robertson pushed across the Slaughter Pen to strike Vincent's center and right flank. The Confederates struck Little Round Top from two sides. Chamberlain's men, facing the 15th and 47th Alabama, soon found themselves about to be flanked. To prevent that, Chamberlain refused his left, bending his line back into a horseshoe. The move stopped the Alabamans briefly, but their commander, Colonel William Oates, rallied his men and sent them forward in another attack. The 20th Maine gave ground, firing as they fell back. Chamberlain moved among his men, inspiring them by his example as he constantly exposed himself to the Alabamans.
Colonel Chamberlain is a great example of personal bravery and leadership this day. He moves amongst his men, he's encouraging them, he's constantly exposing himself to enemy fire. He's wounded twice, once in the hip, and he's shot in the foot as well. And this personal example is so great that the American Army uses it in its leadership manual even today.
4 times the Confederates charged the dogged Maine defenders. 4 times they were thrown back with heavy losses. The forest slope of Little Round Top became carpeted with dead and wounded men as the fighting grew increasingly bitter and bloody. The 20th Maine could not absorb another attack. After starting the fight with 60 rounds of ammunition per man, nearly everyone found their cartridge boxes empty. Chamberlain faced the crisis of his life. Later, he would be forever defined by the decision he would make at this pivotal moment at Gettysburg.
Chamberlain was a student of military history, and in one of the books he'd read, he had come across this account of the Battle of Caldero, which was one of the Napoleonic battles, where an Austrian force had surrounded a small group of French troops. Well, rather than surrendering, these French guys fixed bayonets and charged the Austrians, and the move proved so surprising that the Austrians fell back and the French were able to escape. So here he was on Little Round Top in 1863, and Chamberlain faced almost a similar situation. He couldn't retreat. He was out of ammunition, so he couldn't withstand another Confederate assault. The only thing he resolved that he could do was launch an attack on the Confederates. So what he decided to do was fix bayonets and charge down that hill and surprise the Confederates. And with sheer force and shock value, he would drive the Confederates back and break their assault.
Before Chamberlain could give the order to charge, the men themselves spontaneously erupted from their positions and barreled headlong into the Alabamans. Bayonets forward, the smoke-smeared Maine veterans shattered Oates' final attack. Morale broken, the battered Confederate regiments broke and ran, streaming back westward toward the slaughter pen.
Like many famous attacks in history, the attack of the 20th Maine does not quite go the way the legends have it. It wasn't Colonel Chamberlain out in front leading an organized attack. What actually happened was a few guys had gone out in front to pick up wounded. The colored party followed them, and the rest of the line jumped in behind them. They were so wound up and with their bayonets fixed, they were ready to go. Chamberlain had been hit in the leg twice, so he was not out in front leading any running charge downhill. He was keeping up from behind as best he could, and he never claimed to have led the attack in the first place.
The Union left had held. As Chamberlain's 20th Maine battled Oates' command, the rest of Vincent's brigade had stopped Robertson's rebels cold. They took flight as well, pouring back through the afternoon's battlefield to Devil's Den. As the fighting raged around Little Round Top, the rest of Longstreet's attack rolled forward. Bloody fighting erupted around Sickles' exposed lines, where a peach orchard and wheat field soon became the scene of unbelievable carnage. The task of clearing the wheat field fell to General Joseph Kershaw. He led his brigade into the smoky cauldron as Union cannon blasted his lines with grape shot. Men were blown to pieces or torn apart by the deadly artillery volleys. One Confederate later remarked,
"Oh, the awful, deathly, swishing sounds of those little black balls as they flew by us, through us, between our legs, and over us."
More Confederates joined the attack, and as Kershaw struggled through the wheat field, two more of McLaws' brigades stormed into Sickles' lines at the peach orchard. Despite furious resistance, the Union units began to waver.
Sickles' men were being very hard pressed, and he realized that if he was going to hold this line, he was going to need help. So he called for reinforcements, and Hancock sent him one of the divisions from his corps under General Caldwell. Caldwell's guys show up, and they're thrown into the fray around the wheat field, and that momentarily stabilized the Union lines.
Longstreet, seeing that the Federal lines were beginning to gel around Caldwell's fresh brigades, he ordered his reserves forward at about 6:30. Into the fight went General William Barksdale's screaming Mississippians. They charged through the woods west of the peach orchard and slammed into the point of Sickles' wedge. Without firing a shot, Barksdale's men stormed the apex of Sickles' line, brushing aside all opposition. Union reinforcements were met by withering rifle fire. Sickles' line had been irretrievably broken. At this crucial moment, artillery shrapnel struck General Sickles and nearly severed his right leg. To counter spreading fear that he had been killed, he calmly puffed a cigar as litter bearers carried him off the field. Command of 3rd Corps fell to General David Birney. Birney had his work cut out for him. Practically the entire Corps was straggling back to Cemetery Ridge, where the men established new positions. As they did, General Hancock rode into the area with orders from Meade to take command of the entire Union left wing. He quickly assessed the situation and realized his command was in a very precarious position. Meanwhile, more Confederate troops joined the assault in an effort to exploit the Union retreat. Part of A.P. Hill's corps surged forward just south of Cemetery Hill. As it turned out, Hill's men from Cadmus Wilcox's brigade advanced right into a gap in the Union lines. Hancock could see Wilcox's men heading straight for the hole in his lines. Frantically, he rode off to search for spare troops who could plug that hole. A short distance away, he found the 265 veterans of the 1st Minnesota Volunteers. Approaching the regiment's commander, William Colville, Hancock pointed to the onrushing rebels and said, "Advance, Colonel, and take those colors." It was a death sentence, and the men of the 1st Minnesota knew it. Nevertheless, they leveled their rifles and marched straight into the jaws of Wilcox's entire brigade. For 15 gruesome minutes, the 1st Minnesota lay locked in hand-to-hand battle with a force 5 times their number. When it was over, only 47 men returned to Union lines.
The sacrifice of the 1st Minnesota actually gave Hancock the time he needed to bring up reinforcements and plug the gaps in the Union lines. So by the time Barksdale and some of the other Confederate commanders got to Cemetery Ridge, they were confronted with a very solid Union line, and they were stopped cold. Barksdale himself went down under a hail of fire. Something like 13 bullets hit him. And all of McLaws' division got stopped and then pushed back by a Union counterattack. And it was that counterattack that really ended the fighting for the day on the Union left. Longstreet's entire attack had just unraveled.
As Longstreet's attack failed, Ewell launched a series of uncoordinated attacks in the gathering darkness around Culp's Hill. Vicious fighting ensued, but the Confederates made no gain. By 10 p.m., with the battlefield shrouded in darkness, the day's fighting petered out. The nerve-rending cries of thousands of wounded men soon replaced the din of cannon and musketry. Throughout that second night of the battle, the men on both sides listened to the horrible sound of their dying comrades and wondered if a similar fate awaited them come morning. Despite the loss of thousands of his finest men and some of his best division and brigade commanders, General Robert E. Lee remained optimistic. Convinced the Yankee left had almost collapsed as the sun set on the second day of the battle, Lee resolved to make one last massive attack, using all of his army's remaining reserves. This time he planned to hit the center of the Union lines with some 15,000 men after a massive artillery bombardment from a grand battery of over 150 guns. Lee was under no illusions. Success or failure for the Southern cause hinged on the outcome of this battle. In the pre-dawn hours of Gettysburg's final day, the fighting around Culp's Hill flared up again. An hour before first light, the Federals opened fire on the Confederate entrenchments on the southern side of Culp's Hill.
As the Union troops move forward, they run into those of Ewell, and this action degenerates into a free-for-all in these woods. And as General Lee hears this firing, he is upset and immediately chides Ewell, and is honestly surprised when he learns that the Federals have initiated this attack. And this really shows the superiority of the Union's central position, because although the troops that are involved on the Union side in this action will be used in the center of the Union line later, those forces of Ewell are now taken completely out of the battle, and Lee's plan for a coordinated attack is a shambles.
Already things had started badly for the Confederates, but Lee still planned to deliver his one massive blow despite whatever occurred in Ewell's front.
For July 3rd, Robert E. Lee put together a plan. He had failed to break the Union left or right the previous day, so this time he thought he would go for the center. The last fresh troops he had were General Pickett's division of Virginians and General Pettigrew's division, part of A.P. Hill's corps. Lee's plan was to throw them straight at the middle of Meade's position, just at the southern edge of Cemetery Hill. General Longstreet, who the previous day had thought avoiding attacking the Union Army was a good idea, thought this was an even worse idea today. And, as it turned out, he was right.
To soften up the Federal positions, Lee gave Colonel Alexander command of 170 cannon. Lined up along Seminary Ridge, the guns were supposed to blast the Union infantry and artillery batteries off Cemetery Hill and Ridge. It would be the greatest artillery barrage ever seen in North America. Starting at 11 o'clock that morning, Alexander ordered 2 guns to fire, signaling to all the other battery commanders to begin the cannonade.
The signal guns broke the silence. The blaze of the second gun mingling in the smoke of the first, and salvos rolled to the left and repeated themselves. The enemy's fine metal spreading its fire to the converging lines, plowing the trembling ground, plunging through the line of batteries and clouding the heavy air. The 200 or 300 guns seemed proud of their undivided honors and organized confusion. The brave and steady work progressed.
For part of the bombardment, some 77 Union guns fought back with effective counter-battery fire. But as the clouds of smoke from all the guns grew larger and more dense, the Federal guns slowed their fire. Their commander, General Henry Hunt, didn't want to waste ammunition knowing an infantry assault was imminent. After 2:30 p.m., the guns fell silent altogether, and Hunt removed some of his shattered guns and brought up fresh batteries. Alexander spotted the withdrawal of some of the guns off Cemetery Ridge. At the same time, he realized the Union counterfire had stopped. With his own ammunition running low, he sensed that the time to attack had come. Hastily, he scrawled a message to Pickett that read, "For God's sake, come quick, or we cannot support you. Ammunition running out." Alexander's note reached Pickett at about 3 p.m. After reading it, the general conferred with Longstreet. "General, shall I advance?" Pickett asked him. Longstreet knew this attack was doomed to fail. Overwhelmed with the knowledge he was sending his command to its doom, he could not even reply to Pickett's question.
The effort to speak the order failed, and I could only indicate it by an affirmative bow. Pickett accepted the duty with seeming confidence of success, leaped on his horse, and rode gaily to his command.
The massive Confederate assault force moved through Alexander's gun line and realigned its ranks. Stepping off with parade ground precision, the 15,000 rebels in 10 brigades marched straight for the Union lines. It was an awe-inspiring sight. On Cemetery Ridge, many of the Union troops were relieved that the infantry assault had at last begun, as it meant the end to the nerve-rattling cannonade. As the Confederates marched into the open ground between Seminary and Cemetery Ridges, the Union guns opened fire again. Their shells landed with deadly effect, tearing bloody swaths through the rebel ranks. One Confederate officer recalled later how up to 10 men were sometimes killed by a single cannon round. With hundreds being poured into the Confederate lines every minute of the march, the carnage visited on the attackers was simply unimaginable. While the Confederates pressed on through the barrage, a war correspondent from the Philadelphia Morning Post, watching the scene, jotted down this hasty note.
All our artillery has opened upon them, and we see them falling by the hundreds. In a few minutes, they will strike our lines, and the fight will be at close quarters.
Just as the mass of Confederates reached a rail fence, they came into canister shell range. The Union gunners quickly opened up with savage volleys of this deadly ammunition. Men were torn to pieces by the storm of shot. Nevertheless, Pickett's men closed ranks and doggedly marched forward. On the left of Pickett's division, Pettigrew's men were slow to emerge from a small wooded area just west of the Emmitsburg Road. But as they did, Union guns on Cemetery Hill opened up on them. The division wavered, and men began streaming to the rear.
The converging attack of Pettigrew and Pickett's division toward Cemetery Ridge meant that both of their outer flanks were open. Pettigrew's division was edging over toward the south, towards its right, and as it did so, the 8th Ohio Union Regiment, which was stationed in Ziegler's Grove at the bottom of Cemetery Hill, wheeled out. Doing so put them directly on the flank of Pettigrew's division and allowed them to fire into the flank of Mayo's brigade there. The men of Mayo's brigade took heavy casualties from this flanking fire, and as a result began to break up and straggle to the rear.
On the Confederate right, George Stannard's brigade of Vermont troops moved forward and turned to bring fire on the flank of the attacking mass. The Southern troops recoiled to their left and crowded in toward the center of their assault. With their ranks now being savaged by both canister and rifle fire, the attack began to lose momentum. Behind their wall, the Federal troops were practically invulnerable, and they poured lead into the exposed Southerners.
As the Confederates reeled from the onslaught of Union fire, General Lewis Armistead stepped forward and rallied his men in one last furious push to reach the Union lines. And in fact, they did. They broached the Union lines, and as Armistead was leading them inside and trying to exploit this breakthrough, he was shot and he fell next to a cannon. His men were quickly either overwhelmed or thrown back or captured, and the attack disintegrated, and all of the assault that Longstreet ordered fell apart. So this breach of the Union lines became the highest point of penetration achieved by the Confederates that day, and in reality, it represented the turn of fortunes in the Civil War, and as a result, it has subsequently been known as the high watermark of the Confederacy.
60%, almost 10,000 men, were killed, captured, or wounded during what became known as Pickett's Charge. When he returned to Confederate lines, General Pickett was almost hysterical. General Lee went to see him and told him to look after his division. "General," Pickett cried, "I have no division." With the failure of Lee's grand assault, the Confederate Army's ability to wage offensive warfare had been decimated.
General Lee really remains in position in the hope that General Meade and the Army of the Potomac will attack them and they'll be able to hurt the Union forces in this defensive battle. When he realizes that Meade is not going to accommodate him, he withdraws his army under the cover of a thunderstorm in the middle of the night. As he does so, he has this train of wounded 12 miles long trying to get back into Virginia. Meade will pursue, but only very cautiously, and Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia will escape back into the Confederacy. But Gettysburg is really a turning point. At this point, it's the beginning of the end for the Confederate cause.
Though Lee escaped, his disastrous campaign into Pennsylvania had cost the South some 25,000 irreplaceable veteran troops, along with some of the Army's best officers. Altogether, 50,000 men fell during Gettysburg's 3 horrific days.
In the wake of the Battle of Gettysburg, everybody in the North realized the significance of this victory, and steps were taken to create a national monument and memorial to recognize and honor the war dead there. And in the fall of 1863, Abraham Lincoln was asked to come and dedicate the new national cemetery there. This was a bad time for Lincoln to go because his wife was suffering very, very badly after the death of their son. And she had asked him not to go, but he realized that this was a moment of gravity, that the nation needed him to say a few words. So he traveled to Gettysburg and gave perhaps the greatest 2.5-minute speech in American history.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
As the Gettysburg and Vicksburg campaigns came to their devastating conclusions, the Confederates in the West tried to recapture the initiative after the fall of Chattanooga. Reinforced by Longstreet's corps from the Army of Northern Virginia, General Braxton Bragg launched a counteroffensive designed to drive the Union Army from eastern Tennessee and turn the tide of the war in the West. In Tennessee, the Confederate situation was near collapse that summer of 1863. In early September, after a long campaign, Union General William Rosecrans succeeded in capturing Chattanooga from Braxton Bragg.
This particular campaign is one of the most brilliant little campaign subsets of the war. Chattanooga is a fortress, Lookout Mountain. The bends in the river, if you've been there, you realize, I have to take this place by fire and storm. Rosecrans takes it without a shot. He outmaneuvers the Confederates totally from it. And he did it by stretching out his army. The Confederates didn't know where he was going to pop up, and eventually they figured he's on this flank, he's on that flank. He's coming through this gap, he's coming through that gap. And Bragg evacuates Chattanooga. He's wrinkled out of it.
Bragg fell back into Georgia as Rosecrans split his army and pursued over a 40-mile front. In Georgia, the Confederates were reinforced by Longstreet's corps, detached from Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. As a result, Bragg possessed some 60,000 men by mid-September. With the additional men, Bragg wasted no time in launching an offensive. Rosecrans caught wind of the coming counterattack and quickly concentrated his own army. On September 19th, Bragg's cavalry under General Nathan Bedford Forrest stumbled into the Union left. Both sides fed reinforcements into the fight until the skirmish grew into a general engagement. On this first day, the Confederates made little gain against determined opposition. On the second day, however, luck was not with Rosecrans.
He gets a message that says there is a gap in his lines to some effect. Well, there is not a gap. The troops are there. They just can't be seen in the woods. Well, to cover that hole in the line that isn't there, he moves, I think, Wood's brigade, and he creates a hole in the line. He basically doubles up to cover the hole. And by pure chance, that hole that he creates in the attempt to plug a perceived hole is exactly where Longstreet is going to attack.
Only the superb performance of General George Thomas and his corps prevented the Union retreat from disintegrating into a rout. Along with Rosecrans' reserve corps, Thomas held off the Confederates long enough to earn the nickname the Rock of Chickamauga.
General Thomas on the Union side refused to give up, refused to retreat, refused to join the rout that had developed once the Union line had collapsed. To his everlasting shame, Rosecrans, who was really a good commander, a competent general, ran with the troops, took off, and left Thomas on the field as the only coherent body of troops still fighting. Because of that, Rosecrans was going to be dismissed. He was never going to be used again. But through bad luck and bad timing, which a lot of battles result in, the attack by the Confederates hit right at the point where some troops had been withdrawn, shattered the center of the Union line at Chickamauga, and only Thomas remained to contest it. And his delay was critical in preventing a follow-up pursuit by the Confederates that might have led to the capture of Chattanooga.
We have our Federal Army in real trouble. It retreats back to Chattanooga. It is beaten. It is as if Rosecrans' army can be bagged, not driven, forced to surrender. Bragg could fight a battle. Chickamauga proved that, but he couldn't fight a campaign. He didn't realize that the next day he had to finish the Federals off. They have retreated, they're at a low state of morale, and so he besieges Chattanooga.
In October, Grant became the commander-in-chief of all forces in the West. He immediately relieved Rosecrans and put Thomas in charge at Chattanooga. On the 23rd of October, Grant reached Chattanooga and ordered an attack on the Confederate siege positions at Lookout Mountain. Grant and Thomas planned to break the siege with an assault on Missionary Ridge. Sherman ran into heavy opposition and his 4 divisions became bogged down. To help Sherman out, Grant ordered Thomas to send his men forward to take the rifle pits at the base of Missionary Ridge.
All Grant wanted to do was take the outside little line, take out the rifle pits and some of the skirmish lines, and the troops just keep going right up the hill. They keep going up and take that entire ridge. It's an accident. He doesn't think it could be done. The troops do it themselves as the attack without orders.
Bragg had very few good choices, and the fact that the Confederates collapsed so amazingly and quickly on their position at the Lookout Mountain, you wonder what was going on and why the morale or the condition of the army was so poor that this seemingly impregnable position fell to a direct, straightforward frontal attack by Grant.
Thomas's assault on Missionary Ridge broke the back of Bragg's army. He fell back in complete disarray and lost the initiative in the West. The Chattanooga campaign became one of the most successful federal operations of the Civil War, securing for the Union much of Tennessee while inflicting heavy damage on the Confederate defenders. Worse for the South, Georgia now lay terribly exposed to a Union offensive.
Chickamauga gave the South a chance to redress Gettysburg, but the following battles around Chattanooga meant that the potential that Chickamauga represented would be lost forever. The initiative now is definitely in the hands of the Federals in the West.